Welcome back to Fogman Stories, where we explore true tales touched by Catholic spirituality. Today's story is called The Shadow in the Confessional. It takes us deep into a forgotten parish in rural America, where something sacred still lingers. Though abandoned for decades, the confessional booth in the old church still gives off a faint light each night. No one lives there, no priest serves there, and yet, one stormy evening, a man burdened by grief steps into the darkened church, seeking shelter, seeking peace. What he finds is something beyond understanding, a gentle, forgiving voice speaking from behind the curtain of the confessional, a voice that knows his soul, though no one is there. Who, or what, could it be? Could heaven have sent a holy priest to save a lost soul? This story will unfold over several chapters, told in a gentle, reflective tone filled with spiritual mystery. If you enjoy stories of real-life Catholic encounters, spiritual reflections, and sacred mysteries, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapters on this sacred journey. Now, step with us into the dark, where light never dies. Chapter 1: The Light That Never Dies. They say the light never really went out, even though the last Mass had been held more than 30 years ago. And the parish of St. Bernadette's was officially shuttered in 1991 after scandal and silence swept it away. The locals in Wyoming Valley still spoke of a faint light that flickered on some nights from within the confessional booth. Nobody had the key. The front doors were chained and bolted, the stained glass windows half shattered from storms and vandals. Pigeons nested in the choir loft now. Dust clung to every pew like forgotten prayers. And yet, somehow, there was always that one window. Above the booth, softly aglow. Some claimed it was an electrical fault. Others, the work of teenagers playing pranks. But there were those, quiet, older voices in the town, who insisted it was something else. A presence, one woman once said, crossing herself, not a ghost, something holier, something that waits. It had been years since Thomas Randall had returned to Wyoming Valley. He had left in anger, in silence, carrying the ashes of his childhood faith and the weight of a grief no one else could see. A car accident had taken his daughter when she was only 10. His wife, Marlene, had crumbled afterward, their marriage dissolved in whispers and medication. His heart, hardened, quiet, faithless. He worked in Philadelphia now, a high-rise job, a corner office, a view that meant nothing to him. The city hummed beneath his feet, but he floated through it. He hadn't prayed in over a decade, not since the funeral. But this week, something had cracked. He didn't call it divine. He called it exhaustion. He drove aimlessly after work on Thursday. Didn't go home. Didn't go anywhere in particular. Just drove, past Scranton, past back roads he hadn't seen since he was 17, until the clouds burst open like a held breath, and the rain came down like confession. The nearest shelter was the old church. He hadn't thought of St. Bernadette's in years. He pulled over. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown. Weeds reached up like gnarled hands. The statue of Our Lady out front was stained, her eyes blind with lichen, yet something about it felt untouched. Then he saw it, a faint light, inside the church, inside the confessional. He should have kept driving. But the rain pressed in harder, blurring the windshield, blurring his judgment, and something inside him, something rusted, old, sacred, told him to get out of the car. He crossed the lot slowly, his shoes sinking into muddy gravel. He expected the doors to resist, but the side entrance creaked open with a heavy groan. The church smelled of mildew, candle wax, and memory. He stepped inside, and everything, time, sorrow, even the storm, hushed. The confessional stood to the left of the altar. It hadn't changed. Dark wood, ornate, carved with symbols he once memorized as a boy. A curtain drawn, and from within it, a light. Steady, soft, golden. He approached without understanding why. He wasn't here for answers. He wasn't even sure he believed in forgiveness anymore. But his hand moved the curtain. His knees bent. The wood creaked beneath his weight. And in the silence that followed, Thomas whispered the words he hadn't said since he was a child. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." There was no reply, only the rain outside. He exhaled. "I don't know why I'm here." He closed his eyes, spoke softly. "I don't know if you're real. I'm angry, I'm broken, and I miss her every day." The words came out ragged, as though dragged from somewhere deep. "I don't know if I can be forgiven. For walking away, for blaming you, for never looking back." He waited, and then, a voice, gentle, male, low and steady, like a river moving beneath moonlight. "My son," it said, "God has not forgotten you." Thomas froze. He turned. No one. Just the carved panel. Just the faint light. The voice continued. "You are not here by chance. You are here because grace led you." A chill ran through him. His eyes filled with tears. "Do you know me?" he asked. A pause. "I know your sorrow," the voice replied, "and I know the name of your daughter." And the voice spoke her name, whispered it, like a blessing. Thomas sobbed. The rest of that night blurred. When he stepped back out into the rain, it felt warm. He didn't look back at the church. But behind him, the light in the confessional stayed glowing, unmoving, unburned, unexplained. Chapter 2: A Stranger's Prayer. The air inside the church was different now. It wasn't just the stillness of abandonment, it was deeper. Like stepping into the pause between heartbeats. Thomas Randall stood motionless for a moment just past the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, his breath slow, as if not to disturb whatever presence might remain in the hushed walls of St. Bernadette's. The rain still whispered against the roof, but the storm seemed a world away. A single light glowed from the left side of the nave, the confessional booth. The same golden hue he'd seen from the parking lot. Steady, unwavering, as though it had never gone out. Thomas moved toward it, his steps echoing slightly on the worn stone floor. With every step, old memories stirred. The scent of incense. The sound of organ hymns. His mother's rosary beads clicking gently as she whispered prayers. He remembered the way she'd guide him to the pew. How she'd smile during the sign of peace. How she'd cry quietly during Lent. This place had once held warmth. Now, it held only silence. But something within him, some long-buried instinct, didn't feel fear. Instead, It felt like coming home to a place that no longer knew your name. He stopped before the confessional. The curtain was still drawn. The light from within cast a faint amber glow on the floor. It was foolish to think anyone could be inside. No power, no priest, no congregation. This church had been abandoned for decades. And yet, Thomas's hand moved before his mind caught up. He reached for the curtain and gently pulled it back. The space inside was exactly as he remembered, narrow, cloistered, the wooden seat smooth from years of use. The grille on the side was ornate, carved in swirling patterns of vines and crosses. Beyond it, darkness, but not empty darkness. Something in it felt attentive, expectant. He sat down slowly, knees creaking, hands resting on his lap. Silence. His fingers brushed the hem of his coat. He took a breath, then another, and then, without meaning to, the words tumbled out. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He almost laughed at himself. There was no one there. But he didn't stop. "I don't know why I came here," he whispered. His voice was rough, tired. "I was just driving, and the storm, and then this place." He swallowed. "I haven't prayed in years. Not since we lost her." His throat closed. "I blamed you. I cursed you. I told you I'd never come back. And I meant it." The confession began to crack open something inside him. His voice trembled. His eyes burned. "I see her face every night. In my dreams. In the silence. And I hate myself for surviving." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, as if trying to keep the grief from spilling out. "I failed her. I failed my wife. I failed myself. And I don't know how to come back from that." There was only the sound of his own breath, the soft hiss of rain, the faint creak of wood settling. Then, a stillness, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels like someone listening. And then, a voice. "Speak, child." Thomas froze. It wasn't his imagination. The voice was low, warm, and deliberate, each word shaped like a prayer. I thought I was alone." Thomas murmured. "You are not. I didn't mean to intrude. You have carried this burden too long." The voice interrupted gently. Thomas felt the tears come again. He didn't wipe them away. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "I don't even know who I am anymore." "You are a father," the voice said. Thomas choked on a sob. "You are a son." His chest tightened. "And you are still loved." Silence followed, thick with truth. "How can you say that?" Thomas asked. "You don't even know me." "But he does," the voice replied. Thomas clutched at the wooden seat beneath him. Why would God even care? I turned my back on him. And yet, the voice said, "He never turned his back on you." Something in Thomas broke. He sobbed openly now, hunched forward, fingers digging into his coat. The grief wasn't clean or poetic, it was raw, trembling, wet. The voice said nothing for a while, letting the moment hold. Then, "You came here because you were ready. Grace led you to this place." This moment, Thomas nodded, though he didn't understand. "And now?" he asked. "Now," the voice said, "you must remember who you are, and whose you are." "I can't, I don't know how." "Then begin again." "How?" "Pray with me." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The voice began the Lord's Prayer. Slow and steady, familiar words, long forgotten. stirred in Thomas's throat. He joined in, shakily at first, then stronger. "Forgive us our trespasses," his voice cracked, "as we forgive those who trespass against us." By the end, he was weeping again. "Thank you," he whispered, but the booth was silent. No voice, only the soft glow of the light. Thomas waited. Minutes passed, but the presence was gone. He stepped out of the confessional into the empty church. The storm outside had passed. The world beyond the stained glass glowed faintly with the first suggestion of dawn. He turned to look back. The light inside the booth was still there. He didn't understand what had happened, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to believe again. Chapter 3: The Voice in the Darkness. The light was still there the next night. Thomas hadn't planned to return. He'd told himself the experience was a trick of the mind, a product of exhaustion, grief, and storm-lit confusion. And yet, something inside him couldn't let go. He spent the entire day distracted, barely responding to coworkers, ignoring phone calls, skipping lunch. His thoughts were elsewhere, caught between the memory of a voice in the shadows and the warmth it left behind. That night, without telling anyone, he drove back. The road to the church felt different this time. Less foreign, more like a path he'd once known well but had long forgotten. The trees leaned closer, as if listening. The wind whispered across the windshield. Even the stars above seemed distant, hidden behind clouds that moved too slowly to be real. He arrived just after dusk. St. Bernadette's looked as ruined as ever, overgrown, decaying, but the light in the confessional shone again. Golden, still. He stepped inside without hesitation. This time, there was no moment of awe, no pause at the door. He walked straight down the aisle, past rows of broken pews and shattered stained glass, until he reached the confessional booth. He knelt, silence wrapped around him. He waited. Then, the voice came. "Welcome back." It was the same voice, low, steady, soothing. "I didn't think you'd be here," Thomas said quietly. "I never left." He swallowed. "I don't know what this is, or who you are, but last night, it felt real." It was. Thomas hesitated. "I didn't dream it?" "No." He exhaled slowly. "Who are you?" he asked. There was a pause. Someone sent to listen. That's not an answer. It's the only one you need. Thomas frowned. "Are you a priest?" "I was." The use of the past tense didn't go unnoticed. "Why are you here?" "To remind." "Remind me of what?" "That mercy still waits for you." Thomas was silent. "I don't deserve mercy." "No one does. That's why it's mercy." The words settled over him like soft rain. Thomas leaned forward. "You said you knew my daughter's name." "I did." "How?" "Because you carry her with you. Every breath, every heartbeat, you carved her name into your soul." He flinched. "It's not a curse," the voice said gently. "It's a cry, and heaven hears it." Thomas pressed his hand to his chest. "I still dream of her. She dreams of you too." He blinked. "That's not possible. With God, all things are." A long silence fell between them. Then, "You're afraid," the voice said. Thomas nodded, though no one could see. "Of what?" "Of believing again." of hoping, of forgiving yourself. He shuddered. I don't know how. You will. Grace teaches gently. Thomas bowed his head. The voice continued. You were baptized here. Confirmed. You sang in the children's choir. You cried when your father made his last confession in this booth. Thomas looked up. How do you know that? The voice did not answer directly. Your soul remembers more than your mind ever will. A warmth filled the booth. Not physical, spiritual. A presence. Tears rolled down his face. I don't know what to do, he said. Then begin by being honest. I don't trust God, not after what happened. And yet, you're here. Thomas shook. You don't have to understand. The voice said, you only have to be willing. He inhaled sharply. I want to believe. I really do. Then believe. It's not that simple. But it begins that simply. Thomas closed his eyes. I miss her so much. I know. Is she with him? A pause. She is loved beyond your imagining. A sob broke from Thomas's chest. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent. Minutes passed. Finally, Thomas opened his eyes. Can I come back tomorrow? I will be here. Thomas rose slowly from the kneeler. His knees protested. His hands trembled. He looked toward the panel. Will I ever see you? Silence. He stood. He pulled the curtain aside. The other side of the confessional was empty. He stepped out into the nave and walked quickly to the side door. He paused at the threshold, then turned back. He tried the main doors. Still chained, still locked from the outside. There was no way anyone could have entered. He stepped back into the night, wind tugging at his coat. Above the church, the clouds parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to spill down. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, then whispered into the dark, "Thank you." And for the first time in decades, he smiled. Chapter 4: Whispers of the Past. The voice didn't stop. Night after night, Thomas returned to St. Bernadette's. At first, he tried to resist the pull, to tell himself it was foolishness, delusion, or some desperate product of a mind teetering on the edge of grief. But the truth was simpler. He felt drawn. Every night, the light in the confessional was waiting. And every night, the voice greeted him, gentle, wise, and unwavering. It never told him its name. It never asked for anything. It simply listened, advised, reminded. Some nights, it guided him through prayers long forgotten. Some nights, it spoke of mercy as if it were a living thing. Each conversation left Thomas lighter. Not fixed, not healed, but less hollow. More alive. And with every visit, the boundaries of what he believed began to shift. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was the feeling. That presence. As if the air in the church had memory. As if the walls remembered the prayers once spoken there. On the fifth night, Thomas did something he hadn't done since he was 17. He knelt before the altar. No candles were lit, no choir sang, but something sacred stirred inside him. He spoke aloud. "Who are you?" Silence. Then the voice answered, not from the booth, but from somewhere deeper, beyond hearing. "Find the truth." That night, Thomas didn't sleep. Instead, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "You've got 5 minutes, Randall, and if you start talking ghosts, I'm hanging up." Ben Morales had been Thomas's closest friend once, before life cracked them apart. Now he was a detective in Scranton, running cold cases and chasing shadows for a living. Thomas explained everything, every visit, every word, every time the voice had whispered something no one could have known, especially the name of his daughter. Whispered like a benediction. Ben didn't hang up. He asked for the name of the church. He asked for the year it closed. And then he went quiet. "Randall," he said finally, "you might want to sit down." It didn't take long to find the file. "Louis Delacroix," Ben said, placing the folder on the table. They were sitting in a back booth of a 24-hour diner. The kind where the coffee never tastes quite right and the lights buzz just a bit too loudly. Ben opened the file. Black and white photographs, news clippings, scans of handwritten notes. He was the pastor at St. Bernadette's for over 20 years. Ben said, loved, respected, one of those old school priests who knew everyone by name. Thomas looked at the photo. The man in it wore round glasses, had kind eyes, and a tired smile. He died in '91. Ben said, church fire, electrical, or so they said. He tapped a yellowed article. Local priest dies saving Blessed Sacrament. Apparently, Ben continued. He ran back in to save the Eucharist, the tabernacle, and he never came back out. Thomas felt something inside him shift. That's when the church closed? Same week. Diocese called it a tragedy. Parishioners said it was holy. Some folks even swore they saw light pouring out of the windows during the fire. Thomas swallowed hard. He sounds like the voice. Ben raised an eyebrow. People said his confessions were legendary. He never judged, just listened, always pointed people back to grace. Thomas traced the edge of the photo. What else do we know about him? Ben shrugged. Not much, but there's someone who might. Her name was Mabel Fournier. She lived 2 blocks from the church. She had lived there since 1947. When Thomas and Ben knocked on her door, she answered in a faded pink robe and curlers. Eyes sharp as glass. "If you're selling Bibles, I've already read it," she said. Thomas smiled. "We're here about Father Louis." She froze. Then, slowly, she opened the door. They sat in a tiny parlor filled with knickknacks and sepia-toned photographs. Mabel poured them tea in mismatched china cups. "He was a good man," she said, voice shaking slightly. "Not many like him left. He loved that church. Would sleep in the sacristy some nights. Said God was closer there." Ben showed her the photo. She nodded. "That's him. Always looked like he was carrying the weight of the world, and smiling anyway." Thomas leaned forward. "Ma'am, have you ever seen anything? Since he passed?" She hesitated, stirred her tea. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "Late at night, I'd see a light. Thought it was my eyes playing tricks. But then," she looked toward the window. "I saw him once. Just a glimpse. White vestments. Walking into the church through the side door. Then he was gone." She turned back. "But I know what I saw." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "You're not the first to say that," Ben added. "We've had a couple reports over the years. Never could explain him." Mabel reached under the table and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a rosary, old, worn, polished smooth by decades of prayer. "He gave me this when my husband died. said it would bring peace in dark places. She held it out to Thomas. Maybe it's time it helped someone else. He took it with both hands. The beads were warm. That night, Thomas returned to St. Bernadette's. The wind whispered through the trees. The church loomed, dark and familiar. The confessional light was waiting. He stepped inside, knelt, held the rosary, and waited. The voice came. "Welcome, again." Thomas exhaled. "Are you Father Louis?" A long silence. Then, "I was." "Why me?" "Because you listened." The tears came quickly this time. Thomas clutched the rosary. "Will you stay?" "As long as needed." Thomas bowed his head. The past had whispered, and he was finally ready to hear. Chapter 5: The Priest in White. There is a point in every journey where questions demand more than silence. For Thomas Randall, that moment came 3 nights after receiving the rosary. The conversations with the voice in the confessional had not only stirred something within him, they had rooted themselves in his soul, like sacred echoes refusing to fade. The voice had claimed to once be Father Louis, but never offered more, and Thomas needed more. He needed to understand. So, on a gray Monday morning, with rain licking the windshield of his aging car, Thomas drove west to the diocesan archives in Harrisburg. The Chancery building loomed like a monastic fortress, all stone, arches, and weathered brass lettering. Inside, he was met with hushed corridors, the faint scent of old paper and incense, and a receptionist named Sister Elaine who looked like she remembered Vatican II. "I'd like to see any documents on Father Louis Delacroix," he said. Her eyes narrowed gently. "May I ask why?" "I believe he helped me recently." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Wait here." She returned 20 minutes later with a brown file box and a faint smile. "No one's asked for these in years," she said. "Be kind with them." The reading room was silent but for the ticking of a wall clock. Thomas opened the box. Letters, sermon drafts, photographs, a worn leather journal, and near the bottom, several pieces of correspondence addressed to a seminarian named Michael Landry. Thomas blinked. Michael Landry. The name stirred something. With the help of Sister Elaine, he traced the name through the diocesan directory. Retired, living in a small town 2 hours north. Listed as former seminary professor. Once mentored by Father Louis Delacroix. Thomas called the number. An old voice answered. Michael Landry lived in a modest cottage tucked between pine trees and quiet roads. When Thomas arrived, the old man was already waiting on the porch. Cardigan over his shoulders, eyes bright behind thick glasses. "Come to ask about ghosts?" he said. Thomas smiled. Maybe just a man who didn't leave. Landry laughed softly and waved him inside. The interior of the house was lined with bookshelves, Catholic tomes, framed photos of ordinations, a crucifix over every doorway. He poured them both tea and sat by the fireplace. "I loved him like a father," Landry said. "Louis wasn't just pious, he was luminous. Quiet, yes, but when he spoke, people listened, not out of fear, but longing." "Did he ever speak of visions?" Thomas asked. Landry paused. "He did." Thomas leaned forward. "He once told me," Landry said, That some confessions don't end when the penitent leaves. That there are sorrows so deep, they linger, like residue. He believed some souls get trapped in their own grief. He used to pray for hours after every confession. Thomas nodded. He said something similar to me. Landry stared into the fireplace. Toward the end, he said, Lewis started having dreams. He said he saw faceless people kneeling in the dark, whispering, begging, but no one listened. He kept repeating this line. They cry to heaven but find only silence. A chill crept down Thomas's spine. He believed God was calling him to listen where others wouldn't. Landry walked to a cabinet and pulled out a slim envelope. Inside was a letter dated a month before the fire. In Father Lewis's handwriting, even after I leave this world, may I still serve where needed most. Thomas ran his fingers over the ink. He meant it, Landry said. I think he knew. That night, Thomas returned to St. Bernadette's. He didn't go to the confessional. Instead, he walked to the sacristy, the room behind the altar. Once used for vestments, vessels, and quiet preparation, the door creaked open. Dust hung like breath in the air. The windows were cracked but not shattered. A moth circled lazily in the light from Thomas's phone. He stood in the center of the room and whispered, I found your letter. Silence. I know who you are now. The air stirred. I know you prayed to be allowed to stay. To help, even after death. A faint sound, not quite a voice, not quite a wind, brushed past his ear. Thomas turned. There, on the desk against the wall, lay a leather-bound journal he hadn't noticed before. No dust, no decay. He opened it, blank, but as he turned the first page, words appeared. Are you ready to listen for others? Thomas dropped to his knees. He clutched the rosary, closed his eyes, and whispered, yes. Chapter 6: The Trial of Faith. There is a silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the absence of certainty. Thomas Randall had learned to recognize it. He had sat in it, walked through it, prayed into it, and for weeks, he had heard nothing back. At first, he thought it was just distance, that the voice was quiet because he was meant to listen more deeply, to sit with the stillness. But the days stretched into nights, and the nights into a haunting hush that filled his soul with doubt. The voice had gone. He kept returning to St. Bernadette's, kneeling in the booth where the conversations had once flowed like grace. He whispered the same prayers. He read the same psalms. He clutched the rosary Mabel had given him until his knuckles went white. But the confessional remained still, cold, empty, and then came the diagnosis. A dull pain in his side that refused to fade. A scan, a biopsy, the words spoken gently by a doctor who didn't want to say it. Cancer, stage 4, time left, uncertain, but not much. Thomas laughed, then cried, then did neither. He wandered the streets of his hometown with a numb heart. He walked past his old high school, the library where he once met Marlene, the cemetery where his daughter rested. Everything seemed wrapped in frost, not the kind the winter brings, but the kind that comes when the soul forgets how to feel. He told no one, not yet. What was there to say? That he had finally started believing again, and now it felt like God had left. The nights grew colder, and the silence became unbearable. On the 12th night, without a word from the confessional, Thomas stood outside the church as snow began to fall. He hadn't planned on coming that night. His body ached, his spirit more so, but something in the snowfall, soft, sacred, pulled him toward the steps. Inside, the church was darker than usual. No light from the confessional, no warmth in the walls. He walked slowly to the altar. There, he sat, not knelt, sat, back slouched, hands limp in his lap. And then he whispered, "Where did you go?" His voice echoed, "You spoke to me, you brought me back, and now, when I need you most, nothing." Tears came, slow and steady. "I believed, I trusted, I wanted to change. Isn't that what you wanted?" He looked up at the crucifix hanging above the altar. "So why now? Why like this? Why the silence?" He buried his face in his hands. "Why have you abandoned me?" His sobs filled the empty church. Snow fell quietly outside, pressing against the stained glass like the world itself was weeping. He doesn't remember when he fell asleep, only that the cold of the stone floor met his cheek and eventually, the weight of grief gave way to something softer. A dream. He was back in the sacristy. But it was no longer broken. Candles burned softly. The air smelled of incense. Vestments were hung neatly. Everything glowed. And standing in the center, clad in a white chasuble, eyes filled with light, was Father Louis. He looked younger, stronger, radiant. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Thomas's head. "God is never late, my son," he said, only silent for a while. Thomas wept. Father Louis knelt beside him. "There is a kind of faith," he said, "that only grows in silence, in absence, in pain. It is the faith of Christ in Gethsemane. The faith that says, even if you do not answer, I will still believe." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. When the voice is silent, Louis continued, "It does not mean he has left. It means he trusts you to carry the fire for a while." Thomas opened his eyes. The dream faded slowly, like mist lifting from a quiet field. He was back in the church, alone, but no longer abandoned. Something glowed faintly on the altar, a candle he had not lit. He stood and began to pray, not because he heard a voice, but because he believed one was still listening. Chapter 7: The Final Confession. Thomas Randall no longer feared death. That, perhaps, was the most surprising change of all. It had begun quietly, like mist curling through a forest, not sudden, but inevitable. He still felt the weight of his diagnosis, of the hours slipping away. But he no longer viewed time as a thief. He saw it as a companion now. Since the dream, since the silent blessing of a priest who should not have been there, Thomas had awakened to a different rhythm of life. He gave up his apartment in the city, sold what little he had left, and moved into a small rented room above a church-run shelter in Scranton. He spent his days serving meals, handing out socks and blankets, and praying, not out of fear, but gratitude. He stopped asking for miracles. Instead, he started looking for ways to become one. And people noticed the way he smiled, the way he listened, the way he seemed to carry something invisible but real, like a candle cupped against the wind. One evening, as frost began to silver the gutters and the breath of the city turned to fog. Thomas walked back to St. Bernadette's. It had been weeks. He hadn't returned since the dream. Not because he didn't want to, but because he felt he had already received what he was meant to. The silence had taught him more than words ever could. But that night, something stirred within him again. Not longing, not fear, closure. He arrived after sunset. The church still stood in its familiar silence. Ivy curled up the walls. The bell no longer rang. The stained glass glowed only when the moon was generous. He stepped inside. The air smelled of stone and old wood. No candles, no voices. He walked slowly down the center aisle, brushing his hand across the backs of the pews as if greeting old friends. And then he reached the confessional. It was dark inside. He didn't expect light, didn't expect sound. He pulled back the curtain and stepped inside one last time. The wood creaked beneath him. He sat in silence for a long while. Then, softly, "Thank you, whoever you were." He closed his eyes. "I don't know if I was chosen, or just lucky, but I was found. That's enough." The quiet wrapped around him like a cloak. He made the sign of the cross. And then he stood. When he stepped out from the booth, the light in the confessional burst to life, bright, golden, almost blinding. He froze. The light glowed, pulsing gently, as if breathing, and then it faded, gone. In its place, a soft, sacred scent, frankincense, warm and clean, drifted through the air. Thomas smiled, not because he had heard anything, but because he no longer needed to. He stepped into the nave, looked once more at the altar, and whispered, "I'll carry the fire as long as I can." Outside, the stars had come out. He walked back into the world, not healed, but whole. Was it truly Father Louis who spoke to Thomas in the stillness of St. Bernadette's? Or was it something else? Something beyond human understanding? A spirit of grace? An angel in disguise? We may never know. But perhaps the identity of the voice was never the point. Perhaps what mattered was not who spoke, but what was stirred in the silence. Because something was awakened in Thomas Randall, not just memories, not just hope, but a living, breathing faith that rose from the ashes of grief. A fire rekindled in a man who had once given up on prayer, on mercy, and on the God he thought had abandoned him. And in the quiet aftermath, we are reminded that heaven often answers in whispers, not thunder. That grace is not always wrapped in miracles, but in moments. That light may flicker in the darkness, but it never truly goes out. Faith, after all, does not always come in the sound of a trumpet. Sometimes, it comes in the hush of a confessional no longer used. Sometimes, in the warmth of a rosary worn smooth by sorrow. Sometimes, in the presence of someone who listens, even if they are no longer alive. As the scriptures remind us, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2, ESV. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18, NRSV. I will not leave you orphaned, I am coming to you. John chapter 14 verse 18, NRSV. Whether it was a saint, an angel, or the lingering spirit of a priest who refused to stop serving. The truth is simple. Thomas was not alone, and neither are we. So tonight, if you find yourself in silence, listen. If you find yourself in pain, reach. If you find yourself doubting, pray. Because even if you cannot hear Him, God is never far. He is just waiting in the hush. Thank you for joining us on this spiritual journey. If this story moved your heart or stirred your spirit, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more Catholic spiritual stories inspired by real events. We believe that faith is not just a story we tell, it's a truth we rediscover every time we listen for the quiet voice in the dark. May peace be upon you, and may the light never leave your path.